On April 24, 1967, a Soviet spacecraft came crashing back to Earth at over 400 miles per hour, leaving a crater in the ground and a nation in stunned silence. Inside was cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov, and according to those who knew him, he had climbed into that rocket fully aware that he was going to die. So why did he go? Why did the Soviet Union send a man into space on a craft that engineers had flagged as dangerously defective? And what really happened in those final, terrifying moments before impact? The story of Vladimir Komarov is one of the most heartbreaking and infuriating tragedies in the history of space exploration. And today, we're going to tell it in full. Vladimir Komarov was not the face of the Soviet space program. That was Yuri Gagarin. Gagarin was the smile on the poster, the voice on the radio, the man the world associated with the cosmos. Every child in the Soviet Union knew his name. His face was on stamps and murals. He was the perfect symbol for a program that needed symbols above everything else. Komarov was different, quieter, more technical. He was the engineer's cosmonaut. He was born in Moscow in 1927, the son of a factory worker. He trained as a military pilot and flew with the kind of precision and discipline that makes instructors take note. He was not flashy. He was not charismatic in the way that turns soldiers into celebrities. He was good at the work, deeply good at it, and that was what he cared about. He moved through the Soviet aviation system steadily, accumulating hours and reputation. He was selected for cosmonaut training in 1960, part of the same cohort that produced Gagarin and several other names that would become historic. But Komarov's path through that cohort was different. Where others were groomed for the public role, Komarov was valued for his technical judgment. He was the one you asked when you wanted an honest assessment of a system. In 1964, he commanded Voskhod 1, the first multi-person crewed mission in history. 3 men in a single capsule. No spacesuits, because the capsule was too small to accommodate them. If anything had gone wrong during re-entry, the crew had no protection at all. The risks were extraordinary by any rational measure. The mission succeeded anyway. Komarov brought his crew home. By the mid-1960s, he and Gagarin were close friends. Not just colleagues or comrades in the carefully managed Soviet sense, but genuinely close. They spent time together outside of work. Their families knew each other. Gagarin respected Komarov's technical mind and his willingness to say things plainly when other people around him were staying quiet. Komarov respected Gagarin's instincts and, privately, probably understood better than most that Gagarin's public role put him in a different kind of danger than the one they shared in cockpits. When the Soyuz 1 mission was being planned and assigned, Gagarin was named the backup pilot. The rule was simple. If Komarov could not fly, or refused to fly, Gagarin would take his place. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand the world both men were living in. The Soviet space program in 1966 and 1967 was not primarily a scientific institution. It was a political weapon. Every milestone, every first, every successful mission served as a proof point in an ideological contest that the Soviet leadership treated as an existential priority. The Americans had landed astronauts in Earth orbit. They were developing the Saturn V rocket. They were visibly building toward the moon. Soviet leadership was watching all of it and getting nervous about the gap. And 1967 was not just any year. November 1967 would mark the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Leadership wanted something spectacular to mark it. A Soyuz mission with 2 spacecraft docking in orbit, a cosmonaut performing a spacewalk, footage to broadcast across the world. The mission was conceived as a propaganda event first and a space mission second. The timeline was set before the spacecraft was ready. It was set before anyone could honestly say the spacecraft was safe. The engineers knew it, Komarov knew it, and Komarov, who had built his entire reputation on saying what was actually true about machines, was in an impossible position. The Soyuz spacecraft was meant to be the Soviet answer to the Apollo program. Designed at the Korolev Design Bureau, it was technically ambitious and badly rushed. The timeline between concept and crewed launch was compressed by political pressure in ways that the engineers building the thing could not fully compensate for. Before Soyuz 1 ever launched, the engineers at the Design Bureau had documented more than 200 technical flaws. 200. Not minor software issues or cosmetic problems, structural concerns, system interactions that had not been properly tested, failure modes that had been identified but not resolved. The kind of list that, in a program with genuine safety culture, would have grounded the mission until the problems were fixed. The mission was not grounded. There are credible accounts that Yuri Gagarin co-signed a letter to Soviet leadership warning directly that the spacecraft was not ready to fly with a crew. The letter is described in multiple sources by people who were inside the program. The exact fate of that letter, who read it and what happened after, remains genuinely unclear. What is not unclear is the outcome. The decision to launch did not change. This was the environment Komarov was navigating. He understood the failure list. He understood what it meant in practical terms. He understood that the pressure from above was not going to yield to engineering concerns because it never had, and nobody with any power was willing to force it to. According to accounts from people who were close to him in this period, Komarov made a choice. He flew anyway. Not because he had been given assurances he believed, not because he had found a way to convince himself the risks were manageable, but because Gagarin was the backup. If Komarov refused, Gagarin would be put in the capsule instead, and Komarov would not do that. He would not send the man he was closest to into a spacecraft he knew was going to fail. That decision, a man choosing to walk into something he knows will kill him rather than let it kill someone else, is the center of this story. Everything else is context around it. Now, the specific failures. 3 things you need to understand. First, the solar panels. Soyuz 1 had 2 solar panels that were supposed to deploy after launch to provide power to the spacecraft. The port panel failed to open. This cut the available power in half immediately. The entire mission was running on half its designed power budget from the moment it reached orbit. Second, attitude control. To survive re-entry, a spacecraft must be oriented with extraordinary precision. Point it wrong, and the heat shield is not facing the right direction, and the vehicle disintegrates. The thrusters controlling Soyuz 1's orientation began misbehaving early in the mission. Komarov could not reliably point the capsule where it needed to go. Third, and most critically, the parachute system. A Soyuz capsule re-enters the atmosphere at extreme speed and relies on a staged parachute system to slow its descent to something survivable. A drogue chute deploys first to stabilize the capsule. Then the main chute opens. If the main chute fails, a reserve is available. The way these chutes interact with each other under real conditions was on the documented failure list. The parachute system was the last line of defense in a spacecraft that was already failing in multiple other ways. The political logic that overrode all of this had a brutal clarity to it. In January 1967, the Apollo 1 fire killed Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee on the launch pad during a ground test. The American moon program was going to be delayed by months, maybe more. Soviet leadership saw an opening. A successful Soyuz mission in 1967 could reframe the entire space race in their favor. They were not willing to give that opening back by grounding their own program over engineering concerns. So they launched. April 23, 1967. Komarov boards Soyuz 1 at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. He runs through his pre-launch checks. The rocket lifts off. Ground control watches the telemetry. Within the first few orbits, they confirm what they had feared. The port solar panel has not deployed. The spacecraft is running at half power. Engineers on the ground attempt a series of workarounds to shake the panel loose, having Komarov fire the attitude thrusters in specific sequences to vibrate the panel open. None of it works. The panel stays closed. Then the thrusters start creating their own problems. Komarov reports that he cannot hold the capsule's orientation reliably. He fires a thruster to correct the drift, and the response is inconsistent. He compensates. The capsule drifts again. He is fighting the spacecraft continuously, burning fuel and power he does not have to spare on a problem that should not exist. Ground control runs the numbers on the planned rendezvous with Soyuz 2, which was scheduled to launch the next day and dock with Komarov in orbit. The math does not work. The mission as designed cannot be completed. Soyuz 2 is quietly stood down. Nobody announces this. The mission is already over. The only question is getting Komarov home. For 26 hours, Komarov works the problem. His transmissions to ground control remain calm and professional throughout. He describes the failures as they develop. He responds to instructions. He tries the workarounds he is given and reports back honestly on whether they worked. He is doing precisely what a decorated test pilot with thousands of flight hours does when a machine starts failing underneath him. He keeps flying it until there is nothing left to fly. There is a story that has circulated for decades about Komarov's final moments. That in his last transmissions, he screamed at the Soviet officials who had sent him up in a spacecraft they knew was broken. That he cursed leadership by name. Some accounts describe audio recordings of his final minutes allegedly intercepted by American intelligence stations in Turkey. It is the kind of ending the situation seems to demand. A man betrayed by his own government, finally saying out loud what he could not say before. It is also very poorly sourced. The recordings have never been independently verified. The accounts citing them trace back to a small number of sources, and the sourcing trail gets thin quickly. Serious historians and journalists who have investigated the claim have found the evidence unconvincing. The reality is that we do not know exactly what Komarov said in his final minutes. What we know is that everything in his 26 hours before that point was the work of a professional, doing his job in a deteriorating situation. That is the more honest version of who he was. After 26 orbits, Soviet leadership authorizes early re-entry. Nobody is framing this as anything other than an emergency. Komarov prepares to come home. Re-entry from orbit is not a gentle process. The capsule hits the upper atmosphere at thousands of miles per hour. The friction generates temperatures that would destroy anything without a properly oriented heat shield. Komarov manually orients the capsule for re-entry in a spacecraft with thrusters he cannot fully trust. He gets it done anyway. The drogue parachute deploys correctly. It stabilizes the capsule and slows it in preparation for the main chute. The main parachute does not open. The reserve deploys, but it tangles immediately with the drogue. Two chutes, both useless, wrapped around each other. nothing is slowing the capsule. Soyuz 1 hits the ground. There is no version of that impact that is survivable. The retro rockets, which are supposed to fire in the final meters before touchdown to cushion the landing, fire on impact instead. The capsule catches fire. Recovery teams reach the site and find almost nothing that is recognizable. What remains of Vladimir Komarov is recovered and returned to Moscow. The Soviet state holds a state funeral. His ashes are placed in the Kremlin wall, beside the graves of Soviet heroes and senior party members. The official statement blamed a technical failure, without specifics. There was no mention of the 200-plus documented flaws. No acknowledgement of the engineers who had tried to stop the launch. No accountability for the decision to fly a spacecraft that everyone with relevant knowledge knew was not ready. The public version of the story was a tragic accident, mourned by the nation. For years, the details stayed buried. What emerged much later, through accounts from people inside the program and from archival work after the Soviet collapse, was the fuller picture, including one detail that has proved impossible to shake. Yuri Gagarin reportedly flew to the crash site after learning what had happened. What he saw there reportedly changed something in him that never came back. People close to him described him as different in the months that followed, more withdrawn, less like himself. 14 months after Komarov died, Gagarin was killed when his MiG-15 went down during a routine training flight near Moscow. The circumstances have never been fully explained. He was 34 years old. The two men who had known most clearly what was wrong with the Soyuz program and had been unable to stop it were gone within a year and a half of each other. The Soviet space program suspended crewed Soyuz flights for 18 months after Komarov's death. For 18 months, the engineers who had documented 200 flaws and been overruled, whose warnings had not been enough, those engineers finally had the time and the authority to fix what they had flagged. Soyuz was redesigned in significant ways. Systems were tested under conditions that more closely resembled actual use. The parachute system was rebuilt. When Soyuz flew with a crew again in October 1968, it worked. And it kept working. Mission after mission, year after year, the spacecraft that had killed Komarov became one of the most reliable human spaceflight vehicles ever built. The Soyuz that flies today is a fundamentally different spacecraft from the one that killed Komarov on re-entry. That is not a story about bravery in the abstract. It is a story about what happens when the systems surrounding people who are asked to take extraordinary risks are not worthy of that trust, and about what that failure actually costs when it finally comes due. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe to The Wired World.